Do you notice anything at the outset of this that is a bit unusual for New Testament letters, New Testament epistles? See anything here just in those first 4 verses that jump out at you? Dennis? Okay, clearly whoever's writing this is writing it as a witness, things that he saw, things that he heard, things that he touched, okay? But what does he not include? Okay, doesn't tell you who he's writing to. What else does he not include? There's something even more fundamental. Huh? He doesn't say he's an apostle. Doesn't even say who he is. Okay, and you'll notice in 2nd and 3rd John, the writer simply identifies himself as the elder. And that's one of the first questions that you deal with when you deal with the epistles of John. Why are they referred to as the epistles of John? Paul begins his letters, almost every one of them, by describing himself not only by name, but by function. That he was called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ, a teacher, a witness. All of those things Paul makes very clear. James does so. In fact, John kind of stands as unique. You have Hebrews, which also the writer doesn't identify himself. But how do we know John wrote these things? Well, that's kind of where you have to start when you start with these epistles, is who actually wrote this? I would propose to you at the very outset, I think the evidence is very, very strong that the Apostle John wrote these. But I think it's important that we kind of, that's kind of small. I think it's important that you kind of have some sense of why, over time, through history, the conclusion has been drawn that these letters were written by John the Apostle, okay? As far as we know, John wrote 5 letters in the New Testament. Okay, they are what? Gospel of John, Revelation, and then 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. How many of those letters does John actually identify himself as the author? Only one of them. Okay, only in Revelation. Even in the Gospel of John, John does not tell us who it is that is writing. But there are clues to his writing and to both the Gospel of John and the Epistles of John. Okay? It becomes fairly clear as you study both of these, especially if you ever take the time to read them side by side, that there are a lot of similarities. Do you notice any similarities between the Gospel of John and the Epistles of John? I understand these are somewhat loaded questions and may be a test of your New Testament knowledge, but these are important things. Yeah, at the very beginning, the way that the 2 letters begins, very, very similar, addressing the identity of Jesus. Anybody else? Anything else you notice? Okay, the themes are a lot alike. John writes about the same stuff over and over and over in both the Gospel and the Epistles. You read a lot about things like light and darkness and truth. You read about life. You read about these different hate and love, life and death. Sometimes they're even contrasted that way. And you find them both in the epistles and you find them in the gospel. And the reason actually that most people, most scholars and those who over time have studied the background of these letters, the reason that most of them draw the conclusion that the epistles of John were written by John is because of the Gospel of John, because there's so much similarity between them, and you can start to deduce from various things that John the Apostle was the writer. Now, some things about John that we probably already know. John is introduced to us how in the New Testament? Who is he? How was he described as by identity? These are bad questions. Who was his daddy? Huh? Try it up there. Huh? Zebedee. Who was his brother? James. What function, what role, where are we first introduced to them in the New Testament? Do what? They were fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, in business with Andrew and Peter, okay? And how do they come into the Bible story, the New Testament story? Speak up. Okay, Jesus calls them to be apostles. First they are disciples, and then they are among the 12 that Jesus calls to be his more intimate followers, the ones that are going to be eyewitnesses of Jesus. And there's some things we know about John. We know a little bit about John's personality. He is one of the more interesting of the apostles. How is he identified in the Gospel of John? How does he identify himself? Yeah, the disciple that Jesus loved. He makes mention of this over and over and over. And that addresses not only the fact that John was a follower of Jesus and an apostle of Jesus, but one step further, what more intimate role did you find John playing? Huh? Okay, takes care of Jesus' mother. Before that, well, what does he have in common with Peter and his brother James? Yeah, they are kind of considered an inner circle. Sometimes we refer to these three apostles that way. When Jesus goes into the house of the ruler and heals his daughter in Matthew chapter 9, he only takes Peter, James, and John. When Jesus goes up on the Mount of Transfiguration, he only takes Peter, James, and John. When Jesus goes into the garden to pray on the night of his death, he takes all the apostles, but then he takes Peter, James, and John and takes them farther in and specifically asks them to watch while he goes farther by himself and prays. And at the very end of the Gospel of John, once again, we have a very intimate discussion between Jesus and Peter. Clearly, Jesus trying to reassure Peter after Peter has denied Jesus, and Jesus appears to him at the Sea of Galilee, asks him over and over, do you love me? Peter keeps saying, yes, I love me. Keeps saying, I love you. Feed my sheep. Well, John's also there. John, in fact, is walking along behind listening to this conversation, because at one point, Peter turns and says, well, what about this guy? And so I want you to appreciate that there's clearly an intimate relationship between John and Jesus, which is really quite interesting. On the cross, Jesus asked John to take care of his mother. I don't know why he doesn't ask his brothers to do so yet. Perhaps they don't become followers until after the resurrection. I think that that's a very legitimate possibility. They are a part of the discipleship 40 days later in Acts chapter 1. But we don't know that they are at the cross. Jesus has such confidence in John that he asked John to take care of his mother. What would that make John privy to? Ever thought about this? Jesus' mother, Mary, is taken care of by John probably for the rest of her life. What would that do for John?
He would know all the stories of everything growing up.
Everything about Jesus that Mary knew, all those years that we know nothing of, John knew something of. On top of the fact that he was with him through his ministry, that he was there at the trial. Remember, he and Peter go into the courtyard when Jesus is tried and when Peter denies the Lord. He's there at the crucifixion because he's called by Jesus to take care of his mother. He's the first one. He and Peter are the first ones to the tomb among the apostles. Remember, he outruns Peter, and then Peter goes in first when they get to the tomb. At every crucial moment in Jesus' life, save perhaps for his baptism, this man is there. And he is a very appealing man in a lot of ways. Let me start it this way. Who is the apostle that you would most identify yourself with? Peter? Why? That one should be fairly obvious. Who all would say, hey, I get Peter? Yes? Why? Why do you get Peter?
I think because of his mistakes he made.
Okay.
The repentance part.
Yeah, he makes some glaring errors, but he comes back. Yes, he does. Anything else?
He just acted on his emotions.
Yeah, he is very impulsive and emotional in his actions. He at least in Jesus' earthly ministry, he's not a guarded man. He is very, very impulsive, very forward. Now, he's very courageous. Anything else about Peter that you would particularly identify with? What if I told you that Peter wanted to call down fire from heaven and destroy some of the opponents of Jesus? Do you ever feel that way? But that wasn't Peter that did that. That was John that did that. What if I told you that Peter wanted Jesus to turn and rebuke people that were claiming to be disciples but weren't following along every day with Jesus? You ever feel that way? Hey, if this person was really a follower of Christ, they'd be doing the things the way that the Bible says. That's kind of what is happening there. But that wasn't Peter, that was John. And it wasn't Peter who Jesus nicknamed Sons of Thunder. Now, now, I don't know where that came from, but I have a pretty good idea. You know, I've met a few people in my life that I would say, okay, Sons of Thunder right there. And yet, when we think of John, what's the greatest quality that you generally associate with this disciple? Yeah, he just talks about love so much, both in the gospel and in the epistles. It's easy to think of John as the kind of solid, mild-mannered, never wanes in his conviction, no highs, no lows, no character flaws, and yet he and his brother come to Jesus and ask if they can sit at the right hand and at the left hand. And let me tell you why I bring all this up. What was it about John that made him, quote unquote, the disciple that Jesus loved? Well, I think that we have some insight into kind of the tendencies that he had. Did he have some ego? Yeah, you don't go ask if you can be at the right or left hand unless you have some ambition. In fact, if you read the gospel accounts, the other apostles are indignant with James and John because they come and ask that. There's problems there. And I think sometimes Peter, James, and John probably felt some sense of superiority because there's an argument after the transfiguration over who's going to be the greatest or the greater in the kingdom. And that argument doesn't come up from nothing. It comes up because Jesus takes them up and they see some things and then tells them you can't tell anybody, and you can figure out how the conversation went from there. Can't you see Simon coming up, Simon Zelotes, and saying, hey, what happened up on the mountain? Oh, it was something, but we can't tell you. And in the meantime, they failed at the bottom of the mountain to cast out a demon, and what kind of impact did that have? That's when they start arguing about who's the greater in the kingdom. That's where Matthew 18 comes from. And this idea of brethren that sin and sinning against brethren and how often do you have to forgive. All that discussion grows out. And I would propose to you, all of that is prompted by John. So why is it that John becomes such a beloved figure when he starts off the son of thunder, ready to call down fire from heaven and desiring to be greatest in the kingdom? I would propose to you that you see as much character change, influence in John as you do any of the apostles. Jesus never called to himself mild-mannered, milquetoast, cowardly men. You go through the Bible and the men that God used were always what we would call manly men. But what God did with them was to make them humble men, meek men, men who learned to use their strength in the right way instead of using it for themselves. And I would propose to you, John is the grandest example of that. I read a quote, and it was interesting to me. and here's the quotes. Most disciples identify very readily with Peter. He is, after all, the apostle that we are often most like. John, however, represents the disciple that we most want to be like. And I believe there's a lot of truth in that. And so I would propose to you that this is who writes this epistle. Now, while there's very little internal evidence, okay, he doesn't call himself by name, he doesn't really give us any clues to who he is, the external evidence is overwhelming. In fact, there's very little debate in scholarship that John wrote both the gospel and the epistles, dating all the way back in what we would call the church fathers to within a few years of John's lifetime. Polycarp and Papias were men that are identified as what we call the apostolic fathers, those who immediately succeeded the apostles. Polycarp was a follower, a student, both of these men, students of John the Apostle, okay, who lived all the way to the end of the first century. And he attributes the gospel and the epistles to John, as do a number of writers who immediately followed him. Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, Dionysius of Alexandria, St. Cyprian, and Eusebius, all within 150 years to 200 years of John's death, have copies of his letters, have copies of the gospel, and can trace directly their understanding of his authorship to the men that immediately preceded them. It would be like me getting direct information from my grandfather who heard John. And thus you have probably the strongest attestation of authorship externally that you have anywhere in Scripture, okay? So, there's a lot of elements that come together here. He is a disciple, he's an early disciple, he is very much a follower, he has changed in many ways his character, he has become what God wants him to become, he has spent his life with Jesus, he has spent his life with Jesus' mother, and thus when he starts to talk to us about whether you want to look at the miracles of Jesus and the proof that he was the Messiah, or the epistles where he's writing to people with specific issues, there is great confidence that this is the Apostle John, okay? That may be tedious to you folks, but let me tell you why this is practical. There's a lot of people in our day and age that have great doubts about the reality and the truth of the Bible. Okay, it's what we're dealing with. If you're older, you look at that and go, nah. Yeah. I mean, the challenges that are before us as God's people when it comes to interacting with the world, when it comes to talking to people about the gospel, are a far cry. And I'm talking a far cry from what they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit as we in the lesson this morning. We have to be able to offer good, sound reasoning for why we believe what we believe. Not only what the Bible says, but where it comes from. Okay? And you young people especially, Baylor and Bella and Brian and Bella and all you younger generation folks that you're growing up in an age of doubt that I did not grow up in. And it's going to be a lot harder for you to just start with the Bible, because there's a lot of people not going to start with the Bible, especially you get out of the South or you get out of some of the more conservative parts of this country. And so these kinds of things are important. And we better brace ourselves, folks. Okay? We just better brace ourselves for the kind of work that it's going to take to teach people the gospel in this day and age. Okay? All right, well that raises then the next question, and that is, when was this written? There are two schools of thought. One is a kind of a minor school of thought that John wrote this right around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, right before. He doesn't mention the destruction of Jerusalem. But at a time when God's people in Judea were being tested, and persecution was a very real thing, and the identity of Jesus and the love of brethren. You remember Jesus when he warns the apostles in Matthew chapter 10 that the disciples' love would grow cold and that many would leave and that people would turn on the apostles and turn on the chosen people. There are some people who believe that John is writing this in anticipation of the events that are going to take place and probably actually were taking place. That's proposition number one. The more likely proposition is that John wrote this somewhere around the time that he wrote Revelation and probably around the time that he wrote the Gospel. Most scholars think the Gospel was written first. I'm not sure that you can determine one or the other. But the date that I'm going to go with as far as teaching this class is that John wrote this at the very end of the first century. Okay? And the reason really has more than anything else to do with the purpose. We just read John 1 through 4, okay? Which essentially says, I saw Jesus. I was with Jesus. I know who he was. I know what he did. I have fellowship with him, and I am writing this, as he says in verse 3, so that you can have fellowship, and in verse 4, that your joy may be full. He's going to go on a little bit later in this epistle to say, so that you can know your faith and the certainty of your salvation. Okay? So he writes this as a point of reassurance to people that are already Christians. But at the same time, there's some real similarities going on here to some of the warnings you find in other books. We just finished 1st and 2nd Timothy. What does Paul warn Timothy about consistently in those two letters? False teaching. False teaching that was coming, false teaching that was there, false more that's coming in Timothy's lifetime. Goes all the way back to Acts chapter 20 where Paul warned the elders in Ephesus of such, and they were supposed to be getting ready for that. Okay? As you read Paul's letter to the Colossians, you also find some elements that you find that are very similar to things in Timothy, especially the idea of upholding the obedience to the gospel, to the law, to the commandments of God. And then in Revelation, not so much the vision, but in Revelation 2 and 3, where he's talking to the churches of Asia Minor, and he keeps talking about the Nicolaitans and the various and sundry beliefs that were going on and the immorality among God's people. Those have a lot of similar themes to what you find in John. And I would propose to you, I think this is probably as close as you're going to find to a good explanation, is that John's writing these letters to a group of people that he knows very well. He doesn't have to name himself because they know who he is. It's not like Paul writing to the Galatians where he's got churches scattered across a region that are new Christians that are still grappling with Judaism and who Jesus is and the gospel. We're far removed from that age. Now he's writing to people that are already Christians but that are being threatened by some of the teaching that is going on that was being warned about for decades, and here we are 20, 30 years later, and it's coming to fruition. Let me offer an illustration. There are voices among God's people, and by that I mean people who are part of the conservative churches of Christ, that are dismissing biblical authority, and these are well-known men. Dismissing or redefining biblical authority, putting great emphasis upon the idea that God's grace takes care of us no matter what we do, that some of these minor things like how we use our money are absolutely insignificant when you consider that the grace of God just covers us all. That example and inference and direct command are not the proper way to appreciate and understand biblical authority. That's hermeneutics. And that God the Spirit is moving people separate from what you find in the Scriptures. Those are voices that are taking place among our brethren now. And I'm not making that up. I could name names. I will not do so. And they are impacting a whole generation of people. Anybody want to guess where that all started? Try going back, in my mind, 30, 40 years ago when charismatic thinking started influencing denominations in this country. Why are there so many community churches? Why has denominationalism gone away? I saw an article this morning about the decimation of numbers in the Southern Baptist denomination. Why is that? Because people don't have denominational convictions anymore. Many people, especially younger than us, if you're my age or older, they're not aligning themselves with what they've grown up with. They're community churches. Authority is all about what I feel and what I think God wants, irregardless of what the Bible says, because the Spirit is leading our pastor, preacher, whatever you want to call the guy that's in charge. And they're just spouting off feel-good religion, and the idea that I have to look to the Bible is gone. That influence started in Texarkana with a group that came into town while I was preaching there in the late 80s. And their influence spread across town. And Texarkana is a very backward place as far as religious trends. They've been going on in cities probably 10, 15 years previous. And before you know it, denominations across the town were suddenly Spirit-filled. Okay? That was something you really only saw in one or two denominations prior. Most still tried to argue things based on the Bible. And it has swept through the denomination. It is a part of Catholicism now. The idea that the Pope is calling the shots and that the cardinals and that the catechism is the authority in Catholicism is gone by the wayside, folks. Oh, there's still lip service to it, but this idea of the Spirit leading folks around has been absorbed in every religious institution in our nation and across the world. And over time, it's happened to us. 30 years. If John's writing at the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s, we are 30 years removed from the death of Paul and the letters to the Corinthians and Timothy and to the brethren at Ephesus about the false teaching that's coming. 30 years. That's how fast stuff can go downhill. And people will lose their souls when they become untethered from the Word. Jesus makes that very clear. Okay? So, why is John writing this? I think he's writing to people that he knows well. It's very intimate. The epistles are very intimate. My little children, fathers, young men, brothers. They know who he is and he knows who they are. Which raises the very real possibility that he's writing to brethren in and around Asia Minor. Tradition states that John lived out the end of his life in Asia Minor, specifically in Ephesus. That's what the early church fathers, Polycarp, Eusebius, Irenaeus, make those arguments and offer clear examples of what John did and where he was. I suspect he's writing to brethren in those areas who are being influenced by the kind of changes that Paul predicted were going to take place. Okay? And that's the basis upon which I'm going to teach this particular book. Three big concepts that you find that John reiterates. The first one is that Jesus was God in the flesh, or the Christ. Okay? And it's in John that you find all this Antichrist stuff, okay? And John makes it very clear, Antichrist is not some being that's coming in the middle of the millennium at Armageddon that's going to come and lead the nations of the world, Gog and Magog, against the nation of Israel. John makes it very clear. Antichrist is anybody that denies that Jesus was the Christ. And whatever's going on among Christians, now think about this. Can you imagine people who call themselves Christians that are buying into the idea that Jesus was not the Christ? And yet he affirms this over and over and over. So, who Jesus was, that Jesus was the Christ, God in the flesh, is one of the grand themes. And I wrote it up there, the physical reality, the divine nature of Jesus, the source of life, the sacrifice for sins. Talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. Second thing is, he emphasizes constantly we have to keep the commandments. Okay? Lest any of us think that you can serve God any way you please. John, who is probably the last writer in the New Testament, 3 decades after Paul had finished his work, is still hounding upon the idea that you are not a follower of Jesus if you are not keeping his commandments. And then the third thing is that you've got to love the brethren. Jesus said, this is the way all men will know that you're my disciples. John chapter 13. Because of the love that you have for one another. And you think, well, why would these 3 things come up? And they come up over and over and over. One of the hardest things about John, the epistles of John, is it's really hard to outline it. Because he just keeps coming back to the same thing over and over. I read after a guy who's a really, really good structural thinker. He always thinks in terms of, here's how the structure is. And he sees all this stuff in the text. Pretty interesting. Can become very tedious to me, but pretty interesting. But here's what I found interesting. He said, if you want to know the structure of John is a funnel. He starts with this theme, and he comes around to this theme, and he hits the third theme, and then he comes back to this theme, and he comes back to this theme, comes back to this theme, and it just becomes pointed and more pointed to the end. Well, that's a pretty good way to look at the book. Okay? And then here is what I would propose to be the thing that John's really kind of focused on. Gnosticism was really not fully developed for another probably 100 years after John lived. Okay, so to say that John's writing against Gnosticism is blatantly untrue, and historically that's pretty obvious. But the beginnings of Gnosticism are clearly being addressed by Paul and Peter and John in their writings towards the end of the first century. Gnosticism on the whole was a philosophy, okay? And it was a mix of Oriental mysticism, specifically Persian dualism. Does that intrigue you? Aren't you excited about coming to Bible class and learn about Persian dualism? This goes way, way back. And basically it says that all matter is either spirit or flesh, and it's either good or evil. It's thus dualism, okay? And essentially that what's material is evil and what's spiritual is good. And never the twain shall meet, which raises all kinds of possibilities and all kinds of problems. For instance, we have a body and a spirit. If the body is inherently evil and the spirit is inherently good, how can we have both of those? And how do you account for sin? How do you even account for God? If God is completely good because He's spirit, how could He create man who is physical and thus evil? And then how could He come in the flesh? And as a being purely good, inhabit flesh that is purely evil, and yet never commit sin? How could He be a sacrifice? Do you see some of the problems that just come from that? Then you have Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy carried with it very much this idea of education, of enlightenment. It had a very good versus evil kind of element to it. And so if you start applying these various and sundry philosophies, and then you attach Judaism, where here's a teaching about a creating God and a redeeming God, and a resurrecting God and an eternal God who has these laws and has his own people, but his own people are physical people, but they're sinful people, but he redeems them and he makes them spiritual people. How do you account for all the good versus evil stuff? Okay, and Christianity was influenced by that. And there are a number of very direct references historically to this kind of thinking. All right, Gnostics, as it became fully developed, placed all their emphasis upon the idea of knowledge. And their idea was, the more knowledge you got, the more you became more like God. And you could ascend through these various and sundry levels of, let's just say, godliness. The way that technically it was you had the real God, and then about 30 or 40 different lower levels of God until you got down to wisdom. Somewhere kind of in the middle was the creating God. And he was the creating God because he created matter, and matter's inherently bad. So he couldn't be the real God because the real God could never do anything really bad. And so their explanation was you have what they called aeons, A-E-O-N's. Okay? And they were different manifestations of levels of God. And at some point you came to Christ and Jesus. And Jesus, according to Gnostic teaching, was a man. And that he never was God. He was just a man. And that this manifestation of God that's 20 or 30 levels down from the real God, the Christ, at his baptism came, gave him some power, gave him the things to teach, but left him before the crucifixion, and that the physical Jesus was killed. In fact, there are various variations on that theory. Some Gnostics believe that Simon the Cyrenian, who carried the cross of Jesus, was actually who was on the cross, and that it only seemed that Jesus was on the cross. It's a very involved philosophy. I'm not going into all of it. Okay, but this kind of thinking was starting to infiltrate God's people. Okay, and I categorize some of this up here. The issues for Christians. The origin of matter, creation. We believe that God created the heavens and the earth. Gnosticism would have denied some of that. The origin of evil. Do you believe that God created evil? We do not believe that. And yet the Gnostics at some point had to account for that. The idea of the possibility of an incarnation. A spiritual being is not going to inhabit an evil body. The idea of the resurrection and glorification of our body. If my body's evil, how in the world is God going to raise it, glorify it, and make it suited for eternal fellowship? Fellowship with God for the same reason. The practical use of the body. Here's an interesting way that this played out in reality. If all that matters is my spirit and my body doesn't matter at all, then what difference does it make what I do with my body? Gnosticism took two views of what you did with the body. One was you just punished the body, asceticism. You didn't do anything bad because you're trying to bring it into control. But the more popular was, you just do whatever you want to do because it doesn't matter because your body's evil anyway and your spirit is what's eternal. In Revelation, there are a couple of references to the Nicolaitans, to ungodliness, to adultery, Jezebel, who's throwing brethren into her bed of adultery. All of that kind of idea that we can be Christians and live an immoral life grew out of some of the fundamental teachings of Gnosticism. There was a man in John's day named Cerinthius who lived in Ephesus, who was identified by Polycarp as a man who taught these very things that we're just describing. And that John would not even enter into a public bathhouse because he heard Cerinthius was in there. The famous quote was, let's get out of here, the paraphrase. Let's get out of here quick before the house falls in because Cerinthius is in there. Okay? And I would propose to you that these are the things that John is starting to address. If somebody tells you you can be a Christian but you don't have to do what's right, is there some appeal to you there? Sure, because Christianity requires a lot of discipline. If somebody tells you you can be a Christian and the more you learn, the more righteous you are, and you're going to learn specific words that's going to level you up and you're going to be better than everybody else, do you have to deal with the riffraff of loving your brethren? Nope. It produced a self-righteousness on a level that was not seen among God's people. And if your thinking was that Jesus was a great guy, but Jesus wasn't really God in the flesh because God can't be in the flesh. And I'm going to be a follower of the teachings of Jesus, kind of, sort of, but mainly because I'm going to learn more and become what they called themselves, the illuminated, the pneumatici, the spiritual people. Then I don't have to deal with you. I don't have to obey the Word. I don't have to believe what God says about Jesus. And what three things does John write about? Jesus was God and the Christ. If you're going to serve God, you have to keep the commandments and you have to love your brethren. Well, how do those things apply to us today? I don't know many Christians, people who call themselves Christians, that don't believe that Jesus was the Christ. But I see regularly people who call themselves Christians who will not associate themselves with brethren and become a part of a local congregation. And you can say all day long, I love the brethren, but if you do not participate with the brethren, you are fooling yourself. And it's time to stand up and say this stuff, folks. I'm tired of hiding behind it. And here's the other thing. There are a lot of people who think we can serve God and ignore the Bible. If you love me, keep my commandments. And so there's a lot of practical stuff in these epistles for us. Not everything here do we find in our day and age that's going to be an issue, but a lot of what John has to say we really, really need. Okay, I put schedules back on the credenza there, so you'll know where we're going to be. We need to try very hard to follow them. So pick those up. We will start Wednesday night with 1 John chapter 1. Thanks for your attention.